address some of these problems and make sure that the 400,000 New Yorkers who live in public housing are treated in accordance with the law and also treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve. That's very important to us. Second, a problem that is getting more attention now, but not enough in my view, and that's the problem that's harming folks, whether you're upstate or downstate, whether you're in Queens, Manhattan, a suburb, and it's the problem of prescription painkiller abuse. I don't know if people fully appreciate it. Prescription drugs, that drug abuse affects literally every demographic you have in the country. There were over 22,000 deaths related to prescription drug overdoses just a couple of years ago. Twice as many Americans abuse prescription drugs than those who abuse cocaine, hallucinogens, and heroin combined, and more die from it. Every day, about 46 people die from prescription painkillers, and that's again here in Queens, the island, you name it, it's happening in our communities. Close to 50 Americans will die from abusing prescription painkillers like oxycodone every 29 minutes. And so that's a reason why we have made it a top priority in our office to figure out ways to go after unscrupulous pharmacies and doctors who are peddling this poison knowing that it's causing so much damage, so much harm. We shut down a pharmacy that was operating in Brooklyn and in Queens just in the last year that was literally dispensing hundreds of thousands of pills to people that they knew were addicts and causing a great deal of harm. And the second problem that arises from the prescription pill problem is that the pills are actually getting so expensive that to maintain the high, people who are getting addicted to the pills have started to use heroin. And so the painkillers are becoming a gateway drug to heroin. I was a line prosecutor for a while, some years ago, before I got to lead the office more recently. And when I was a line prosecutor in the early 2000s, the thing that we worried about, in the cases that I prosecuted more, had to do with cocaine and with crack, and that has changed. I met with my narcotics chiefs just last week to talk about how it's flipped. And people are a lot more concerned and spending a lot more time and energy and resources and expertise on the issue of heroin abuse and heroin distribution rather than cocaine. That problem is not solved, but the heroin problem has become very acute, and it's especially acute and problematic with our young people. The percentage of New York State high school students who reported using heroin more than doubled between 2005 and 2011, and they're still going up. So law enforcement is doing its part. There has been a 110% increase in heroin seizures in New York since 2009. The levels are higher than any year since 1991. Last year, and I'll stop with the very sad, tragic statistics in a moment, heroin deaths outpaced homicides in New York City last year. That's saying something. So we're working as hard as we can to prosecute the people who are peddling this poison in our communities in Queens and elsewhere, to shut down corrupt pharmacies and corrupt doctors. But there is an opportunity and a responsibility for people in the public, particularly those that are involved in civic organizations like this, to raise the alarm bell also. So there should be more public education, more training of our doctors and hospital personnel, more treatment, more opportunities to deal with addiction. I have done, in 6.5 years of the job, one public service announcement. Because it's hard for me to memorize my lines, so I said, and it was on the issue of prescription painkillers. So that's how important an issue is to us. Let me give you a third example of people who I think don't get enough attention and deserve to have every privilege that everyone else in New York has. If you have a disability and you live in this city, you have a right to equal access to enjoy every privilege of living in the greatest city on earth. If you have a disability, you should still be able to dine at any restaurant that you would like. That's why our office launched the restaurant initiative a few years back and did a number of inspections of restaurants around the city to make sure that everybody knew that here we are, more than 25 years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, they got to shape up, because there's no excuse for it. If you have a disability, you should be able to still enjoy the theater and the opera, which is why we had cases against theaters and other public facilities that showcase the best music in the world in New York City. If you have a disability, you should still be able to enjoy a ball game. And that's why a few years back, even before I got there, my office led the charge to make sure that the new Yankee Stadium was fully compliant with the ADA. And it's one of the best facilities around for people to enjoy sports in that regard. And finally, if your child or your grandchild has a disability, she should still be able to go to her local school, right in her community, especially, as I said, more than 25 years after the ADA was passed. And we're in the process of addressing that also. Because we understand the harm to a child who can't be part of her own community, who can't be part of the after-school activities that take place in her community, because she might have to be bused hours and hours in both directions to go to a school, because the school that's down the street, that's literally down the street, is not equipped to handle a wheelchair. We had, in a public report that we filed against the city some time ago, pointed out a fairly sad story about a mother who was literally going to the school multiple times a day to carry her daughter with a disability up and down the stairs, because the school did not have the ability to let her go up and down to different floors in the school. That shouldn't be the case in 2016 in New York City. In other words, people with disabilities should be able to enjoy and experience all of the greatness of New York, just like everyone else. Fourth example, folks who have been caught up in the criminal justice system. Now, I know everyone thinks of us as prosecutors, and we are, and that we spend most of our time, and the bread and butter of our work, is prosecuting people who have committed crimes. But that does not mean that people who have been charged with crimes, whether by the state or by the federal authorities, should be forgotten about. And that is why, especially if you're a young person, and you've been caught up in the criminal justice system, you still have rights too, especially if you're a pretrial and presumed innocent. And that's why folks in my office have spent a large part of the last 3 or 4 years investigating the absolute disgraceful mess that is Rikers Island. Rikers Island, I think, by every account, is broken. It's a place where, as we outlined in our report to the city, where brute force is the first impulse rather than the last resort, a place where verbal insults are repaid with physical injuries, where beatings became routine and accountability rare, and where a culture of violence endures, while a culture of silence prevails. On any given day at Rikers Island, 15 to 25% of the adolescent population, so these are the young folks in Rikers Island, were in punitive segregation, often for nonviolent conduct. That means solitary confinement in a punitive way. That, by the way, among other things, has come to an end. It's come to an end at Rikers Island. It's also come to an end in the federal system in the Bureau of Prisons, where an executive order was issued to make sure that adolescent young people are not subject to punitive segregation anymore. In our view, as people should understand, the rule of law applies to everyone, not only to adolescent criminal defendants, but also to adult corrections officers. And if there's one thing that history teaches, is that violence always begets violence. And the culture of arbitrary violence at Rikers must come to an end, which is why we entered into a consent decree to be enforced and to be enduring with a federal judge just in the last few months. By the way, and I know you know this better than most people, given the work you do in the community, the cost of a broken Rikers Island or a broken jail of any sort is borne by all of us. Because the cost of that culture is the sum of the incalculable expense of an unchecked cycle of violence, the increased recidivism, of emergency and long-term medical treatment, of legitimate lawsuits that the city must settle, and maybe most importantly, a loss of faith and confidence in our criminal justice system as a whole. And that's a cost that none of us should have to bear, and none of us should have to bear any longer. Finally, I'll come to the issue that I think bears on everyone, whether you're young or old, whether you're in the criminal justice system or not, whether you have a disability or not, and that's an issue that has been mentioned a few times, and that's public corruption. Now, public corruption, unlike some other crimes that might affect a particular neighborhood or a particular community or a particular geographical location, public corruption affects every single person who is a resident or a citizen in New York. Whether you're engaged or not, whether you pay attention or not, whether you vote or not, that's the nature of our social contract. And none of the things that you hope to come to pass through your advocacy, through your civic organizations, or as citizens, parents, and members of the community, none of those things can come to pass if your government is not honest, if your government is not on the level, if decisions are not made on the merits, and if the game is rigged. And I will say today, as I say all the time, it doesn't get picked up as much when the articles are written, there are so many good people in government, in elected office, who are doing great things and are honorable and have integrity and have loyalty to the law and want to do things the right way. And the problem is, it's ruined for them because of the bad folks, many of whom my office has sent to jail over the last few years. I worked for a fighter for New York for 4.5 years. I was chief counsel to Senator Schumer, who I think would have been here today, except his daughter is getting married. And so I have great respect for the legislative process, for the legislative bodies, but the problem is there's too much corruption going on, and we're too busy fighting it. Everyone knows about the Assembly Speaker, Sheldon Silver, and the Majority Leader of the Senate, Dean Skelos, who are scheduled to be sentenced literally in the next couple of weeks. But it's a problem, once again, it's a problem that's upstate and downstate, it's urban, it's suburban, it's Democratic, and it's Republican, and Queens is not immune either. And I know there are some fine public servants who were here and elected members who came and said hello, but there have been members of your ranks who have not been so upstanding. One, I'll mention just briefly, you had a councilman named Dan Halloran. He's serving a 10-year prison sentence, which is a long time for a white-collar offense. And it's a sad thing to have gotten people's votes and then to sell your oath of office. And what's most troubling about the Halloran example is what he said in his own words about everyone else and maligning everyone else. And he was caught on tape after receiving a $7,500 cash bribe, saying to our cooperating witness in that investigation, quote, "Money is what greases the wheels, good, bad, or indifferent." During that same meeting, and I often say, when people say, well, Preet's always talking bad about politicians and politics, I use the words of people who were elected themselves to speak for themselves. Halloran says, quote, "That's politics, that's politics. It's all about how much. And that's our politicians in New York. They are all like that. All like that. And they get like that because of the drive that the money does for everything else. You can't do anything without the effing money." Close. He didn't say effing, he said the but it's a daytime audience. And I have to point that out to him. Like, I don't think he's right that that's everyone, but it's too much. And more has to be done about it. And after statements like that you hear coming out of the mouths of people that you yourselves have elected, and after the string of public corruption scandals that we continue to expose, many may understandably fear that there is no vote that is not for sale, no office without a price, and no official clean of corruption. Many may understandably resign themselves to the sad truth that maybe the most powerful special interest in politics is self-interest. Now, I think that we have the best corruption-fighting team in the business, and we will continue pursuing every corrupt official that we can. But as I say, every time I talk about public corruption, you can't prosecute your way out of the problem. No public safety issue, whether you're talking about Rikers Island, or you're talking about prescription pills, or you're talking about night shift, or anything else, you can't prosecute your way out of it. It takes the efforts of the public, the press, politicians themselves, and the public especially, through organizations like this and collections of organizations like this. Putting dirty politicians may be necessary, but it is not sufficient. And it will take a lot of effort from a lot of people. As somebody said earlier in the program, you are the folks who hold politicians' feet to the fire. So if you demand change, or you demand reform, or you demand a better quality of person holding those seats, then that can come to pass. And it can only come to pass if people care about it, and people clamor for it, and people get angry about it. I like to quote from Edward R. Murrow, who said, and this sums it up better than I can, he said, quote, "A nation of sheep will beget a government of wolves." I think that's true, and that's been shown, I think, throughout New York. So, I know you're waiting for food to come, so let me just end where I started. Gives as much applause as the politicians. By just stressing the energy and diversity of Queens, because it's both a metaphor, to my mind, and also a microcosm, and it is a slice of what makes America great. It's a tremendous honor to be here, as I said, but I often think back to my favorite speaking event. This is my second favorite. My favorite speaking invitation I've ever gotten, and it was a couple of years ago, when I was asked to speak at a citizenship ceremony, where 75 or so folks were taking the oath of citizenship for the first time downtown in Manhattan. And that happens every day in in courthouses and civic buildings around the country, and it's incredibly moving. I'm a naturalized citizen myself. I invited my parents to come. And I challenge you to name any other country where on any given day, foreigners from 31 different homelands might be happily swearing an oath of allegiance to a country they were not born in. You can't do it because there's no such country. Only America welcomes everyday populations of people like my mom and dad, people who ate biryani before they ate burgers, who learned cricket before they learned baseball, who felt only limits before they felt freedom. Only America announces, as a fundamental principle, your right to the pursuit of happiness. And in this country, and in this county for that matter, where more languages and cultures and cuisines coexist than anywhere else, we are bound together in ways we don't always appreciate. And so, because whatever country you come from, whatever name you give your God, whatever book you deem scripture, whatever rituals of religious faith you observe, whether you were Orthodox or Reformed, whether you were devout or lapsed, whether you pray or not, when you become an American, you are bound to every one of your fellows in the greatest country that has ever existed by a pious faith in the enduring principles of liberty and equality and the rule of law. That is the founding formula for our country, for our democracy, for our prosperity. That is the reason that people of all faiths and all colors and all cultures come here. That's the reason those same people invest here and build here and stay here. That's the reason so many of your families came. And it happens to be the reason my own family came. And it's the reason I can be standing before you today, the son of a father who came from virtually nothing, who was born more than 75 years ago in a colony still ruled in the name of the King of England, who later absconded to the US with barely pennies in his pocket, and with a young wife and an infant son with an unpronounceable name, who less than 40 years later somehow became the chief federal law enforcement officer in the financial capital of the world, which says much less about me than it says about America. That's why